That will conclude our official business for the day. We are very, very pleased. The senator from the 44th District has been working, we talked about this a year ago, and how quickly a year passes. He spent this year really reading a number of books, I'm sure he will mention, preparing for this speech, and I'm truly excited to hear his reflections and thoughts on this important day, and would like to welcome the senator from the 44th District up to provide remarks.
There we go. All right. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank our president for inviting me to do this address for this year's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Some were mentioned earlier, some guests were certainly introduced, but I wanted to make certain to introduce my family that's here this evening, while my mother could not join us but is out in cyberspace watching us. I have my wife, Amara Sydnor, my mother-in-law, my father, and my three daughters, and you had an opportunity to get the prayer this evening from my father-in-law. So it was mentioned that I read 13 or so books. I read a number of books, but certainly read a number of articles in preparation for tonight's speech. And many of you know, when I was an undergrad, I was a history major. So doing this was really exciting for me because I got to learn a lot about Martin Luther King, many things that I did not know. So it's an honor to be able to address you all here this evening to talk about Dr. King's legacy. But I also wanted to make certain that I thanked DLS's librarian, Sandra Mueller, who helped me to gather a variety of legislative records. So when contemplating my address, I wondered what I could share about one of our country's most well-documented persons of faith. 2 months before his death, and during the Drum Major Instinct sermon, Dr. King instructed us, when remembering him, not to mention where he went to school, nor his Nobel Peace Prize, nor his 300 or 400 other awards, because to him those things were not important. So in obedience, I will not mention any of those things this evening. Instead, as we sit here in the twilight hours of today's holiday, I want to share the historical journey around Maryland's celebration of the Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So we lost Dr. King on April 4th, 1968, when he was felled by an assassin's bullet. Throughout this nation, many mourned. Here in Maryland, that same day, our governor and former Baltimore County Executive Spiro Agnew noted, in part, that he shared the shock of the nation upon learning of the killing of Dr. King. He continued, "Words at a time like this are inadequate to express the overwhelming horror of this senseless act. I can only say that I extend my deepest sympathy to the family of Dr. King." The next day, he sent a telegram to Mrs. King, sharing this sentiment with her, and saying that the people have lost a strong voice of reason and hope at a critical time in our history. Within days of his assassination, U.S. Representative John Conyers and Senator Edward Brooke introduced bipartisan federal legislation to declare Dr. King's birthday a federal holiday. The introductions of the legislation were among the first acts that would culminate into the holiday that we celebrate today. State legislators acted as well. What I call this holiday legislation, it was signed into law by the governors of Connecticut and Illinois in 1973, and Massachusetts on July 8, 1974, making them among the first states to recognize this holiday in some manner. But what about Maryland? With years of community advocacy and the working of many legislators, Maryland actually was among the first states in the nation to honor Dr. King by declaring his birthday an official holiday. Now, the legislative journey of recognizing this holiday is a prime example of incrementalism that we all know very well, right? For 6 sessions, legislation was introduced in Maryland to recognize Martin Luther King Day on January 15th, his birthday, as a legal holiday, and that's which is most similar to the holiday that we celebrate today. But remember, we're here on the 20th, not the 15th. So our story begins during that fall of 1969 when the Maryland State Teachers Association adopted a resolution urging Governor Agnew to set aside a day each year to focus on the importance of human rights. Prior to resigning as governor to transition into his new position as a U.S. Vice President, Governor Agnew complied and proclaimed January 15th as Human Rights Day in Maryland. The proclamation stated, in part, that all citizens should recognize the many stresses that tend to divide our nation, and he encouraged school and professional education organizations to plan activities on the 15th to promote goodwill among all citizens. While deserved, the proclamation fell well short of celebrating Dr. King. However, a few days later, on January 21st, Delegate Isaiah Dixon Jr. and Senator Clarence Mitchell III, both of Baltimore, introduced the first pieces of legislation recognizing January 15th as a legal holiday to be known as Martin Luther King Jr. Day. While Delegate Dixon's bill didn't proceed, Senator Mitchell's bill made it to this Senate floor, where he amended his own bill to require memorial observances in schools rather than the holidays initially sought because he didn't have the support to pass the bill as introduced. One senator lamented, "I don't think this gentleman has served good enough for this nation." Noting that Dr. King espoused the principle of civil disobedience, he continued, "Anyone who's going to defy the law is not entitled to be recognized by this state." Nevertheless, Senator Mitchell's bill passed in the Senate, 37-3. However, our state's first efforts to codify this holiday honoring Dr. King ultimately died in the House. The following January, Governor Marvin Mandel, like his predecessor, proclaimed January 15th as Human Rights Day in Maryland, and Delegate Dixon reintroduced his legislation. Now, the record's not clear. I don't believe there was any introductions from the Senate side anymore after the first introduction in '69. An editorial in the Afro-American newspaper critiqued Mandel, stating that he reacted like an overly cautious politician rather than a high-minded statesman. About the same time, one of Dr. King's closest advisors, Bayard Rustin, published an op-ed in the Afro, noting in part, the most obvious reason for creating this holiday is to pay honor to Dr. King and to the principles for which he lived and died. As the leader of what has come to be called the Second American Revolution, Dr. King achieved a stature comparable to that of our founding fathers. Rustin argued that this holiday would pay homage to Dr. King and to the values for which he lived and died. Rustin further stated how Dr. King made the first American Revolution whose principles of equality and liberty were marred by the Three-Fifths Compromise. Leading a movement and articulating its most profound desires, Rustin said that for this reason alone, he deserves to be honored by this entire nation. Unfortunately, Delegate Dixon's legislation did not pass. So the next session in 1971, on January 13th, about 75 to 100 community members, including clergy and students from the Key School and Annapolis Senior High School, assembled that afternoon outside the State House steps for what Reverend and later Delegate Wendell Phillips called a very fitting tribute to Dr. King, and it was sponsored by the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance. Advocates delivered a petition with about 2,000 signatures intended for Governor Mandel, but it was delivered to William Atkins, a member of the state's Human Relations Commission. The petition expressed the community's desire for both the General Assembly and Congress to make Dr. King's birthday a legal holiday. Now, according to Carl Snowden, a teenager at the time, and I believe Mr. Snowden, is he here? We saw him earlier. He was a member of a Truth and Soul member, and he said that Mr. Atkins told the marchers that the governor would give the petition his careful and conscientious attention. In fact, Governor Mandel expanded upon the 1970 proclamation and proclaimed January 15th not simply Human Rights Day, as he did before, but Martin Luther King Human Rights Day. As he did in the prior two sessions, Delegate Dixon reintroduced the same legislation to establish January 15th as that legal holiday. But Governor Mandel, while praising the civil rights leader as a great man, said that there were already too many state holidays. I know some of you have heard that before. I see Senator, no, I won't say, I was about to say your name. We've heard this before, right? He said holidays were costly to state government and the public at large, signaling the likely fate of Delegate Dixon's legislation for the session. He would not be the first to raise costs as a concern for enacting this legislation. Here in the Senate, while legislation was not introduced by any member, Senators Welcome, Abrams, Burns, Curran, Lapidus, Blount, and Dalton introduced, and this body passed, Senate Resolution 4, honoring Dr. King's legacy on January 15th. Likely taking a cue from the governor's comments, on March 17th, Delegate Dixon's bill was reported out of Ways and Means and amended to establish that the third Sunday in January was going to be Martin Luther King Day, and to provide that that day shall be a day of prayer in honor of Martin Luther King. Delegate Kenneth Webster, who was one of the co-sponsors of this legislation, lamented that this is just the kind of thing that Dr. King fought against, believing that the amended bill's passage was simply a form of tokenism. Nevertheless, the General Assembly passed Delegate Dixon's bill on April 2nd, and it was signed into law May 24th, 1971. While this was the first piece of legislation to pass our General Assembly in remembrance of Dr. King, this legislation did not create a legal holiday. Needless to say, Delegate Webster did not believe the work was complete. So the following session in 1972, Delegate Webster took up the mantle and introduced legislation to repeal the prior year's law and establish the 15th as that holiday. His bill was ultimately amended, and when it passed, it read, "The 15th day of January of each and every year shall be proclaimed by the governor as Martin Luther King Day, and shall be a day of prayer in honor of Martin Luther King." Now, this legislation was signed into law on May 5th, and it achieved the goal of recognizing Dr. King on the 15th, but it still fell short of it being a legal holiday. Delegate Webster did not give up. The following session on February 2nd, 1973, Delegate Webster again introduced legislation to repeal the prior session's law and to establish January 15th as that legal holiday. His legislation was referred to Ways and Means and ultimately did not pass. In a 2009 interview with the Baltimore Sun, Delegate Webster recalled the struggle to get Dr. King's birthday recognized as a legal holiday. He shared that while he served on Ways and Means, the Ways and Means Committee, the chair, Delegate Ben Cardin, kept telling him, "There ain't no money. We can't." And Delegate Webster retorted, "There ain't no such thing as we can't. It's we won't." During the 1974 session, Delegate Webster attempted a third time to have this legislation passed, introducing House Bill 320. Ways and Means debated dropping Defenders Day from Maryland's legal holiday, but ultimately agreed not to remove it and reported Delegate Webster's bill out without change. But things got very interesting when the bill made its way to the House floor. Despite the fact that the members of the General Assembly are expected to vote when we are on the floor, during the initial vote, so many delegates abstained that the bill died 71 to 24, one vote shy of passage. This included a few delegates from Montgomery and Prince George's County's delegations, and the Sun reported 11 East and South Baltimore delegates took a walk. Delegate Webster moved to reconsider the vote. The Washington Post reported that several of the House's 12 black members urged their non-voting colleagues to vote for the bill. Additionally, 2 Baltimore County delegates rose in support of the legislation as well. While urging his colleagues to reconsider the first vote, Delegate Rind stated, "It's about time we honor someone who's important to all Americans, not because he's black, but because he's a person we all respect." In spite of his 1963 accusation about Dr. King to the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce that Dr. King created dissension, confusion, and unrest by deliberately going in areas where colored people have been very well satisfied and whipping them up into a fervid heat of passion and hate for the white race, Delegate C. Maurice Weidmeyer argued the legislation will cost the state at least $80,000 in overtime payments to state employees who have to work on holidays. This argument would be rehashed throughout the nation in many state houses and the federal government when similar legislation was considered. Anyhow, it was reported that 8 of those delegates who had abstained before, many nervously fingering their voting switches until the last minute, swung around and voted for the bill after both black and white delegates made an impassioned pleas for the measure's passage. On the second ballot, the bill was approved 82 to 23 and was sent to the Senate for consideration. Delegate Webster's bill was assigned to Senate Finance, where a similar discussion about dropping Defenders Day from the list of legal holidays occurred, but ultimately they left Delegate Webster's bill intact and sent the bill to the floor. This body adopted the favorable committee report and voted unanimously, 29-0, to pass the legislation. Delegate Webster's bill was signed into law by Governor Mandel as Chapter 440 of 1974 on April 30th, 1974, making Maryland the 3rd state to pass legislation of this nature. The law enshrined January 15th, Dr. King's actual birthday, as a legal holiday in Maryland and went into effect on July 1st, 1974. And in that same 2009 interview with the Baltimore Sun, Delegate Webster said, "I just felt that the United States ought to recognize him." Nationally, efforts to recognize Dr. King's birthday as a federal holiday were not successful until 15 years after its initial introductions in 1968. In 1979, President Carter took up the mantle, but ultimately it was President Ronald Reagan who signed the bill on November 3rd, 1983, authorizing his birthday recognition as the federal holiday to be celebrated on the 3rd Monday of January, beginning in 1986. In 1994, President Bill Clinton signed Congressman John Lewis and Senator Harris Wofford's legislation into making the King holiday a national day of service. Here in Maryland, our law was updated that same year to expand the holiday to reflect the passage of federal legislation and one subsequent time to its current form that we now celebrate under today. In retrospect, the efforts here in Maryland had nowhere near the vitriol as some other states or even Congress, where both U.S. senators of North Carolina attempted to sully Dr. King's name by raising all sorts of details regarding Dr. King's relationships, outraging some of his colleagues. But I wanted to take note to one thing that was said by Kansas Senator Bob Dole, who silenced critics who raised arguments about cost when he said, "I suggest that they hurry back to their pocket calculators and estimate the cost of 300 years of slavery, followed by a century or more of economic, political, and social exclusion and discrimination. It would be 17 more years after President Reagan signed the bill until all 50 states observed this holiday. South Carolina was one of the last states to approve Dr. King's paid holiday for state employees in 2000. While all 50 states now honor Dr. King, efforts have continued to update the holiday in Alabama and Mississippi, where it's also Robert E. Lee Day, honoring the Confederate Civil War general whose birthday is January 19th. To this day, Legislators in both states have attempted to bifurcate those holidays. So in closing, and I appreciate seeing that everyone is still awake, Dr. King asked us to remember that he tried to give his life serving others. He tried to love somebody, to be right on the war question, and to feed the hungry, to clothe those who were naked, to visit those who were in prison, to love and to serve humanity. This is how he wanted us to remember him and why we honor him today. So as we reflect on the years-long struggle within this legislative body to recognize this holiday, I hope that we are guided by the words of his 1967 speech, The Other America, because history will be obligated to remember you in the best light if you do this. And Dr. King said, we must realize that the time always is right to do right. Thank you.